Dear friends, welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module titled Ernest Gellner and Benedict Anderson on the Nation and Nationalism, which is part of the political sociology paper. What is a nation? How is it formed? What do we understand by the term nationalism? What are the ingredients and what are the characteristics of the nation? Does the nation precede industrialism and reformation and the whole rationality that came in, or did the nation formation take place post industrial revolution and post Renaissance period in Europe? These are some of the questions that are to be answered in this module. Ernest Gellner and the idea of nation. Ernest Gellner was one of the most prominent theorists who had worked on nationalism and the idea of nation. He taught at London School of Economics and Political Science. His own life experience as a Czech Jew who became a British citizen and moved back to Prague in his final years had a major impact on his views on nationalism, modernity, and personal identity. Gellner grew up in Bohemia, the early Czech, during when the leaders were trying to create a Czech national identity amongst the subjects. Time was marked by nationalism and industrialization, a phenomena which greatly interested Gellner and became the focal points of his thinking. Belonging to a later generation of Bohemian Jews than Kafka, Gellner experienced both German and Czech nationalism but only imagined belonging to Czech culture, despite his family's loyalty towards the Habsburg Empire. Gellner's major contribution to the subject is the socio-economic analysis of nationalism. His book Nations and Nationalism was declared one of the 100 most influential books written since the end of the war. Gellner argues that nationalism appeared and became a sociological necessity only in the modern world. Thought and Change, Nations and Nationalism are the renowned books amongst the many he has written. In Nations and Nationalism, Gellner's contribution to a conventional understanding of nationalism has been significant. In order to deal with the issue of nationalism, one needs a critical lens to look into the subject. Nationalism was regarded as a component of national history rather than as a distinct subject. The great theorists of modern society, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, have written little on this. Nationality was treated as something given, whether it is good or bad. The way nationalism is linked to state and nation, an inevitable link between the nation and the people in the particular nation draws attention. It is only in the interwar period that nationalism became a subject of explicit and general analysis. Nationalism is not a new concept, however. The amount of attention it gained is something new. Elie Kedourie, in his book Nationalism, has summarized that nationalism is a doctrine invented in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. Gellner argues in a similar lines and further states that only during the interwar period it gained more attention. The approaches to nationalism have gained importance. We usually understand nation in terms of national history, common culture, or some sentiments. In this context, in the 1980s, Gellner's idea of nation and nationalism provided a different perspective, which called idea of nationalism as a political principle. Gellner thought of modernity as a distinctive form of social organization and culture. He sees nationalism as a function of modernity. Some historians argue that nationalism was modern and nationalism produced nations, not the other way around. However, Gellner disagrees with this position and argues that the idea of nationalism was product, not producer, of modernity. He focused on break in human history, which propounds three different stages within it. According to Gellner, firstly, hunting stage, pre-agrarian. Secondly, the agrarian stage. And thirdly, the industrial age. He explains various concepts through these transitions. The emergence of new kinds of knowledge and values, the defects of various issues about these transitions from feudalism to capitalism. According to Gellner, nationalism is one of the aspects of these changes. Gellner, in his idea of nationalism, elucidates that nations and nationalisms are not natural because they are not a permanent feature of human condition, but came into being with the transition to industrialism. Gellner's theory of nationalism states that nationalism is not a sentiment expressed by pre-existing nations. Rather, it creates nations where they previously did not exist. Nations can only be defined in terms of the age of nationalism. It is nationalism which engenders nation, not the other way around. Nationalism uses the pre-existing historically inherited proliferation of cultures or cultural wealth, and most often it transforms them radically. In the name of nationalism, dead languages can be revived, traditions are reinvented, and quite fictitious, pristine purities are restored. Gellner strongly argues that the cultural shreds and patches used by nationalism are often arbitrary, historical inventions. Nationalism is not what it seems, and above all, it is not what it seems to itself. The culture that it claims to defend and revive is often its own inventions or is modified out of all recognition. There is every possibility that with the overtly self-worshipping tendencies, the nationalist principle and the idea of nationalism have its own emanations and selections which are profoundly deceptive and distorted. It is to say that the mechanism of nationalism thrives on certain things like bringing back the old cultures and making them appear as if they are inevitable to understand one's own idea of nations. The project of nationalism is to revive the cultures and reaffirm them, eventually leading to the national liberation. But it perpetuates, defends, and reaffirms the already existing high culture, paying less attention to the culture that needs attention. In Gellner's words, nationalism is primarily a political principle, which holds that the political and the national unit should be congruent. Nationalism can be a sentiment and a movement. In brief, nationalism is a theory of political legitimacy, which requires that entire boundaries not cut across political ones, and particularly that of ethnic boundaries within a given state, separate the power holders from the rest. This means the way the idea of nationalism is driven is highly political, and it can assume legitimacy and claims the authority over a territory. The minute we call something as political, it already underlines the strategies and mechanisms that it undertakes in order to gain legitimacy and legitimize the actions and political behavior of that particular issue. This means it uses culture, language, and several other issues which are actually not natural, but it seems like as if it is something which is already given. It is here he calls nationalism as an ideology, suffers from pervasive false consciousness. It inverts reality and it claims to defend folk culture, while in fact it forges a high culture. Nationalism is a manifest and self-evident principle, accessible as such to all and violated only through perverse blindness. It preaches and defends continuity, but owes everything to a decisive and unutterably profound break in human history. Preaches and defends the cultural diversity, but imposes cultural homogeneity both inside and outside, and also between the political unit. Its self-image and its true nature are inversely related. Hence, it seems obvious that we can't learn too much from the study of its own prophets. What we need to deny is to accept nationalism in its own terms. The links between state and the nation can be elaborated in the following. The inevitability of the state is questioned by Gellner and argues the various facets of nationalism in this framework. State being the institution are specially concerned with enforcement of order. The state and its institutions are separated out from the rest of the social life. This is to say that not all societies are state endowed. It immediately tells us that the problem of nationalism does not arise for stateless society. That means nationalism emerges only in milieu in which the existence of the state is very much taken for granted. In Hegelian words, the absence of the state is inescapable. In simpler words, the problem of nationalism does not arise where there is no state. It does not follow the problem of nationalism arises for each and every state. On the contrary, it arises only for some state. The primary understanding of man without a nation is someone like a man without a shadow show. The inevitable aspect of nationalism, which has been made essential and fundamental to human life. Having a nation is not an inherent attribute of humanity, but with time it has come to appear as such. As Elie Kedori argues that what becomes crucial is to understand that nationalism imposes homogeneity. It is rather than homogeneity imposed by objective and inescapable imperative, which eventually appears on the surface in the form of nationalism. Gellner puts that nationalism is indeed an effect of sequences of industrialism. Though nationalism is indeed an effect of industrial social organization, it is not the only effect of imposition of this new social form. Hence, it is necessary to disentangle it from those other developments. Gellner problematizes how nationalism is seen as something which is natural and universal, ordering of political life of mankind. Among the other aspects of Gellner's work, there are two crucial aspects which goes into the construction of the theory of nationality: will and culture. If we define a nation as something in which the groups will have to come together, this brings us to a problem. Will, consent and identification were never absent from human history. Rather, they were accompanied by fear and interest. Also, any definition of nations in terms of shared culture is another net which brings in far too rich a catch. Human history is and continues to be well endowed with cultural differentiations. It becomes easy to define nationality in terms of shared culture, but what is forgotten is the idea of how culturally plural all of us are. As mentioned earlier, nation can be defined only in terms of the age of nationalism, rather as we might expect the other way around. The summation of awakening and political self-assertion, nationalism, highlights the idea of nationalism and nationality. It is nationalism which creates nation. Traditions are reinvented, culture are revised, and history is revisited. Finally, all this revokes the feeling of nationalism and creates a nationality. The basic deception and self-deception practiced by nationalism is essentially the general imposition of a high culture on society, where previously low cultures were to take the place of high culture. Nationalism usually conquers in the name of folk culture, which exactly it does to oppose in reality. The high culture and the nationalist feelings are created through print media, post-Enlightenment period, where Benedict Anderson also argues the same. The textbooks, social spaces, and public institutions are ingrained in the process of creating a nation, nationality, and the idea of the typology of nationalisms can be constructed by working out on various possible combinations of the crucial factors which enter into the meaning of modern society. The access to education and modern high cultures questions fundamentals of nationalism. The power holdings positions in society showcase who has high culture and who don't. Most often, the agenda of nationalism and nationalists becomes so crucial in terms of spreading high culture rather than understanding the nuances of the lower culture, which is very unlike the constant claims of the nationalist principles. In terms of power, bifurcated society, there are four distinct possibilities. It may be that only power holders have access, that they use their power privilege to preserve for themselves the monopoly of this access, or alternatively, that both the power holders and the rest have this access, or again only the rest have such access and the power holders do not, or finally, as sometimes happens, that neither party enjoys the benefits of such access. Or put it in simpler terms, that the power holders, those over how the power is exercised. By combining the inequality of power with the various possible patterns of the distribution of the access or to education, we have obtained four possible situations: equal access, equal lack of access, access tilted either in favor of or against the power holders. Here, the role of communication plays a critical role in the dissemination of the nationalist idea. The connection between nationalism and the facility of modern communications is to a certain extent misleading. It gives the impression that a given idea happens to be there and the same will remain untouched. The most important and the persistent message is generated by the medium itself, by the prominence role of which media has acquired in modern life. Nationalism is a very distinctive species of patriotism, one which becomes pervasive and dominant under some social conditions which in fact prevail in the modern world. According to Gellner, Nationalism is a species of patriotism which are marked by loyalty, cultural homogeneity, which thrives on high culture. What is important to be highlighted here is the fact that at the core of his definition of nationalism, Gellner asserts that nations ought to be ruled by co-nationals. Though liberals nationalists insist on this to be the case, however, they reiterate that this must be done with unequivocal consensus of the co-nationals. Gellner did not hesitate to tell his readers that nationalism is not worth examining because it represents a mixture of myths, human superstition, and false consciousness. The suggestion that nationalism cannot tolerate ethnic, racial, or religious differences is refuted by the existence of multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multi-religious nations. Yet, because Gellner asserts that the essence of nationalism is to attain that close relation between state and culture, he preludes it with the charges of population exchange or expulsions, more or less forcible assimilations, and sometimes liquidation. By far, this is the most deficient sign of his understanding of the variety of political methods available to modern political systems. Benedict Anderson and Nations as Imagined Communities. Benedict Anderson is the author of one of the most significant concepts in political geography of nations as imagined communities. Guggenheim Fellow and member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, Anderson was born in Kunming, China in 1936. Brother of political theorist Perry Anderson and an Irish citizen whose father was an official with Imperial Maritime Customs, he grew up in California and Ireland before attending Cambridge University. In 1983, the publication of Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism, established Anderson's reputation as one of the foremost thinkers on nationalism. In the book, Anderson theorized conditions that led to the development of nationalism in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in Americas, and gave the eminent definitions of nation as an imagined community. Anderson and Gellner are contemporaries and share the same timeline of work. The interstate war period, the ongoing Cold War, has raised many issues related to nationalism during the 1980s. The works of both Anderson and Gellner have contributed immensely to the understanding of nationalism. According to Anderson, nationness is the most universally legitimate value in political life of our time. Nation, nationality, and nationalism are different to define but can be analyzed. Anderson tries to give satisfactory interpretation of the anomaly of nationalism. According to him, nationality and state and nationness are cultural artifacts of a particular kind. In order to understand this, they demand profound emotional legitimacy. This means we create or imagine a bond between the people of particular nations which we think is ours. The theorists of nationalism are often surprised by the following propositions. Firstly, the objective modernity of the nation to the historian's eye vis-a-vis the subjective antiquity in the eyes of the nationalist. Secondly, the formal universality of nationality as a socio-cultural concept, which indicates that in the modern world everyone will have and should have a nationality. Thirdly, the political power of nationalisms vis-a-vis the philosophical poverty and incoherence. In simpler words, to say nationalism has never created thinkers of its own. Rather, many thinkers are critical of it in many issues. Tom Nairn sharply puts, nationalism is the pathology of modern development. History, which has a built-in capacity for descent to dementia, rooted in dilemmas of helplessness, trust on most of the world. The nationalism as idea has been made a nationalism with capital N as an ideology. The crucial elements of Anderson's understanding of nationalism comes in through his anthropological spirit, where he calls a nation as an imagined political community and imagined as inherently limited and sovereign. It is imagined because the members of that particular community might have never seen, never heard or met, but the idea of all of us belonging to a particular territory as nation instills the idea of community and the feeling of togetherness. Gellner makes a comparable point here. The nationalism is not awakening of nations, to self-consciousness. It invents nations where it does not exist. Gellner's notion has been criticized for his claims of nationalism as masquerading under the false pretense where he calls it by invention, assimilation and falsity, etc. For Anderson, it is an imagination and creation. The communities are never interacted face to face, but they imagined. Communities have to be analyzed not by the falseness or genuineness, but by the way they imagine themselves being part of it. The net of kinship and clientship have been created through the imagination of nation and nationalism. The imagination of nation is always finite and limited. No nation would imagine something which is boundaryless or limitless. The imaginations of nationalism are highly constricted. Most crucially, irrespective of exploitation and inequality, one imagines the nation with horizontal and deep comradeship. This proves how people are willing to die for their nation. But what brings people together is not just the imagination of nation and nationalism itself, rather also dying for one's own nation. The answer lies in cultural roots of nationalism. Anderson proposes that nationalism first emerged at the end of the 18th century amongst Creole communities, and that the conceptual model was pirated around the world until it was set in eradicable places. Although officials' nationalism was from the start a conscious self-protective policy intimately linked to the preservation of the imperial dynastic interests, subject people soon took control of the nations imagined by colonial powers. Imagined communities initially demonstrate a recognizably Marxist economic determinism. Local bourgeoisie has to acquire enough capital to launch print capitalism. There has to be a national market for printed material, and similar economic circumstances determine the seemingly unstoppable course of nationalism as it is pirated around the world. Once the world has organized itself into nations, however, history stops. Revolutionary leaderships inherent nations, and however hostile they may be to the idea of nationalism, they consciously unconsciously come to play lord of the manor. Anderson shoots the horse from under him and discarding the Marxist analysis, which he has carried his theory to modernity. The nation is now a permanent and seemingly ahistorical political reality, and aside from the possibility that the established array of nations may face fracture into the greater number of nations, Anderson recognizes no further opportunity for subsequent geopolitical communities to emerge. The overwhelming response of the burden of one's own nation comes from the cultural imagination. It is most often said that nation states are new and historical, but the ideas and imaginations that it evokes showcases the issues that are immemorial, which talks about limitless future in limited nations. This shows magic of nationalism, which turns chance into destiny. Nationalism is not understood as a political ideology, rather as a cultural system which brings people together. It is not the idea that nationalism is simply growing out of religions and dynastic realms, rather the very availability of these ideas and accessible tendencies of those ideas instigates the feeling which is beyond our immediate identities. The origin of national consciousness and the sense of belonging essentially came from the primacy of print capitalism. The mass production process that it has involved created a massive sense of imagining themselves in relation to others too. The manuscript knowledge was scarce and not available easily but through print, which indeed became easily accessible for most of the people. Reproducibility and dissemination were two important things that have been focused by print to instill the national consciousness. Print has changed the appearance and the state of the world. Firstly, revolutionary verticalization, thrust of capitalism directly contributed to the rise of national consciousness. Secondly, the Reformation at that time owed much of its success to print capitalism. Thirdly, the slow, uneven geographical regions have also been equally covered with the advent of print. The point, languages were also distinct in the ways where they adopted the local vernacular languages and published the material in those languages. This also contributed to immense readership and dissemination of ideas. The secular, particular ideas of nationality have also started to sow seed to imagine one's own community. The convergence of print, technology and capitalism has created a possibility of new form, imagined community, which led to the basic morphology of the modern nation state. The character of nationalism is to create roots of fear about ourselves and roots of hatred about others. Nations often inspire love and especially self-sacrificing. The cultural roots of nationalism, which are symbols, poems, places and monuments, often showcase the self-sacrificing love for nation, which further created the feeling of love for nation. This naturalizes the feeling of belongingness and crystallizes the nationality. Through the system, this happens the realization of imagined communities. Most often we imagine nation in homogeneous, empty time and space. The memory and forgetting is another crucial factor in the way we understand nationalism. The conscious acts of what to forget and what to remember remind us not just as individuals but as community, which is inextricably linked with others too. To conclude, in this module we have seen how Gellner and Anderson construe the idea of nation and how they believe that it was modernity a prerequisite for the formation of nation. It was also the print media which was responsible in largely creating a mass consciousness, so to say, in creating a normative order in which almost everyone believed in, that created this whole imagined community. However, this imagined community, in this imagined community, not everyone is equal, as we have seen, and there are those who are at the margins of this whole imagined idea of a nation. And this comes about because not everyone comes from the same social location and not everyone believes in the same idea of the nation. Thank you.